They laughed until their throats were raw. Perched atop their impregnable cliffs, the Japanese engineers sneered at intelligence reports of American amphibious tanks. Metal coffins, they called them, between drags of cigarettes and technical calculations. How could such cumbersome machines navigate coral reefs, let alone scale volcanic rock? Their mockery echoed across the Pacific until that blood-red dawn, when Japanese engineers mocked US amphibious tanks until one climbed their cliffs. The grinding of metal against stone silenced their laughter forever. Subscribe to witness how a single machine rewrote the rules of warfare. Lieutenant Tanaka unfolded the intelligence report with practiced indifference, his weathered fingers tracing the crude sketches of American amphibious vehicles with something approaching amusement. Around him, the engineering bunker carved into the volcanic rock hummed with activity as his team refined the coastal defenses that had been deemed impenetrable by Tokyo High Command. Outside, the Pacific wind howled against the jagged cliffs that rose nearly vertical from the churning sea, nature's perfect complement to their carefully positioned gun emplacements and reinforced pillboxes that dominated every conceivable landing zone. "Gentlemen," Tanaka announced, unable to suppress a rare smile that cracked across his normally stoic face, "it seems our American friends believe they can send tanks through water." The assembled engineers paused their calculations, turning toward their commander with expressions ranging from confusion to outright disbelief. Tanaka pinned the intelligence sketches to the planning board, the crude lines depicting what appeared to be a standard Sherman tank, modified with primitive waterproofing and propulsion appendages, looking absurdly vulnerable and ungainly even on paper. Engineer Yamamoto, the youngest and most brilliant of Tanaka's team, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and studied the drawings with scientific curiosity before breaking into uncharacteristic laughter. "With respect, Lieutenant, even if such a monstrosity could float, which physics suggests is dubious at best, it would never navigate our coral reefs, and even if by some miracle it reached shore." He gestured toward the topographical map showing the island's defensive perimeter, where 60-degree slopes of volcanic rock formed a natural barrier that had required their own men months to conquer with specialized climbing equipment. The overhead lights flickered momentarily as distant thunder rolled across the island, the approaching storm matching the dark humor that spread through the bunker as the engineers began calculating the specific ways such vehicles would fail. Watanabe, the hydraulics specialist, sketched quick diagrams showing how the surf alone would swamp the engine compartments, while Sato, their metallurgist, estimated how quickly saltwater would compromise the drive mechanisms of such theoretical machines. Their mockery took on the air of a professional game, each man eager to identify the most catastrophic potential failure point. As rain began to lash against the narrow bunker windows, Lieutenant Tanaka allowed the moment of levity to continue, knowing such respites were increasingly rare as American forces pushed closer to their island chain. He studied the impossible cliffs visible through the streaming glass, their black volcanic faces slick with rain and nearly vertical in their ascent from the narrow, reef-choked beaches. For 3 years they had been reinforcing these natural defenses, placing interlocking fields of fire to cover every approach, calculating bullet trajectories and explosive radii with mathematical precision until no square meter of the potential battlefield remained uncovered. In the fading light of that rain-soaked afternoon, the engineers of Imperial Japan returned to their defensive calculations with renewed confidence, their brief amusement at American folly having strengthened their absolute certainty in the impregnability of their position, unaware that across the vast Pacific, the very machines they had so confidently dismissed were already being loaded onto transport ships, and that their laughter would soon catch in their throats like the acrid smoke of burning ambition. The secret hangar at Fort Knox hunched against the Kentucky landscape like a wounded giant, its curved metal roof gleaming dully under the harsh security lights that burned day and night. Inside, Major Robert Thompson moved between the hulking shapes of experimental vehicles with the nervous energy of a man running out of time, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space as his team of engineers and mechanics worked with the desperate focus of men who understood exactly how many American lives depended on their success or failure. "She's not ready, sir," insisted Chief Engineer Dawson, wiping grease-stained hands on a rag that had long since lost its ability to clean anything. "The new treads are gripping better on the test wall, but the engine still overheats after 20 minutes of climbing at full load." He gestured toward the massive test apparatus at the far end of the hangar, where a section of artificially constructed wall mimicked the volcanic formations of Pacific Islands, its surface scarred by hundreds of previous test runs where metal had clawed desperately at stone. Thompson ran his hand along the modified hull of the prototype they had code-named Mountaineer, feeling the specialized grouses, extended cleats on the tank treads designed specifically for vertical climbs, that represented just one of dozens of radical modifications to the standard Sherman chassis. The Amphibious capabilities had been challenging enough, requiring complete redesigns of the engine air intakes, exhaust systems, and drivetrain waterproofing. But it was the climbing ability that had nearly broken his team's resolve, requiring innovations that military engineers had previously deemed impossible. Outside the hangar, the Kentucky rain fell in sheets across the testing grounds, where earlier prototypes sat abandoned like fallen beasts, their hulls cracked or treads shattered by the unforgiving physics of attempting to drive a 30-ton vehicle up a near-vertical wall. Each failure had brought increased scrutiny from Washington, where generals with traditional tactical mindsets questioned the entire program's viability against the backdrop of wartime material shortages and the pressing need for conventional equipment on multiple fronts. "Pacific Command radioed again this morning," Thompson said quietly, his voice nearly lost among the sounds of welding and metal grinding that filled the hangar around them. "The island assaults are stalling on exactly the terrain we predicted. Standard landing craft can't get past the reefs, and infantry are being cut to pieces trying to scale the cliffs under fire." He didn't need to elaborate on what this meant. Everyone in the hangar had seen the casualty reports, had memorized the topographical maps of islands still to be taken, had calculated the human cost of conventional approaches. Dawson stared at the tank for a long moment, before nodding once, decisively. "Give us 48 more hours. We'll run the engine hotter than specs allow and reinforce the cooling system. She won't last long at that burn rate, but she'll climb that damn wall." Around them, the engineering team had fallen silent, all eyes on the two men and the machine between them, that represented either a revolution in warfare or another failed experiment to be abandoned in the Kentucky mud. Thompson placed his hand on the cold metal hull, feeling the weight of expectation pressing down like the crushing depths of the Pacific itself, knowing that across that vast ocean, Japanese engineers sat confidently behind defenses they believed no machine could possibly overcome, their certainty as solid as the volcanic rock beneath their feet, unaware that American ingenuity was about to redefine what was possible on the battlefield. Dawn broke over the transport ship USS Perseverance in shades of wounded crimson, the horizon a jagged line between sea and sky that seemed to bleed into itself as Chief Mechanic Wilson made his final checks on the Mountaineer. The vessel had been specially modified to accommodate the experimental tank, with reinforced loading ramps and a dedicated launch platform that now hung precariously over the churning Pacific waters. Around him, the ship's crew moved with the tense efficiency of men who understood they were witnessing either a revolutionary moment in warfare or an elaborate, expensive failure that would cost precious lives. "Weather report just came through," Captain Harris announced, appearing beside Wilson with the quiet intensity that had made him the natural choice for this classified mission. "Surf conditions are at the upper limit of our parameters, and visibility will be poor until midday." He didn't state the obvious alternative. that they could postpone the launch until conditions improved, because both men understood there was no time left for caution, not with the main landing force already engaged and taking heavy casualties on the beaches below the Japanese positions. From their position 6 miles offshore, the island appeared as little more than a dark smudge against the brightening sky, its volcanic peaks disappearing into low clouds that promised rain before noon. Wilson could not see the flashes of artillery or hear the distant thunder of naval bombardment, but he knew the preparatory barrage had been underway since midnight, a desperate attempt to suppress enemy fire long enough for conventional forces to establish a beachhead. What the Naval Command didn't yet know, what only the handful of men on this special transport had been told, was that their entire tactical approach was about to change. "The drivers ready?" Wilson asked, though he already knew the answer. Lieutenant Collins had been training for this moment for months, spending countless hours in the prototype, learning its unique handling characteristics in water and on the specially constructed test slopes. The young officer had developed an almost mystical connection with the machine, sensing when to push the straining engine and when to let it cool, how to feel the treads finding purchase on seemingly smooth surfaces, and most importantly, how to keep the massive vehicle balanced during the critical transition from horizontal to vertical movement. Captain Harris nodded, his weathered face betraying nothing of the doubt that must have plagued him, as it did all of them. He knows this is likely a one-way mission. The extraction plan is theoretical at best. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Even if the mountaineer succeeded in scaling the cliffs, something it had accomplished only under controlled test conditions, there was no guarantee it could navigate the enemy defenses at the summit or link up with friendly forces who would have no idea of its existence or purpose. The loading bay suddenly filled with activity as the final preparations began, technicians swarming over the tank with last-minute adjustments while the ship's crew secured the launch apparatus. Wilson watched as Lieutenant Collins emerged from below decks, his young face set in an expression of calm determination that belied the mathematical improbability of his survival. As the lieutenant climbed into the tank's hatch, he paused for just a moment, scanning the horizon where the dark island waited, seemingly impregnable in its volcanic fortress, unaware that within its defensive calculations an impossible variable was about to be introduced. The mountaineer slipped beneath the Pacific surface with surprising grace for something so massive, disappearing into the churning waves with only a momentary disturbance before the special flotation system stabilized its hull. Inside the sealed compartment, Lieutenant Collins felt the familiar disorientation of transitioning from ship to sea, the controls suddenly alive beneath his hands as the tank became its own vessel, independent and vulnerable in the vast ocean. Through the limited visibility of his periscope, he could see only the endless procession of waves, occasionally catching glimpses of the island's dark silhouette when the mountaineer crested particularly high swells. Water pressure increased against the hull as he guided the tank deeper, navigating by compass and the carefully memorized bathymetric charts that detailed the underwater approach to the island. The reef system that had so confidently been deemed impassable by Japanese defenders loomed ahead, its coral formations like skeletal fingers reaching up from the ocean floor. Collins adjusted his depth, feeling rather than seeing the dangerous formations as the mountaineer's specialized sonar pinged soft warnings through the control panel. The technology itself another rushed innovation that had barely been tested before deployment. The mechanical symphony around him intensified, water rushing past the sealed compartments, the propulsion system straining against the increasing resistance, the hull creaking under pressure it had never been designed to withstand. Each sound registered in Collins' mind as either expected or concerning, his senses hyper-focused after months of training to distinguish between normal operation and potential catastrophic failure. A new sound, A scraping that vibrated through the floor plates signaled contact with the outer reef, the first real test of whether the mountaineer could accomplish what naval engineers had deemed impossible. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cooling systems that struggled against the heat generated by the overtaxed engine. The temperature gauge edged steadily toward the red zone as Collins maneuvered through the labyrinthine coral structures, sometimes with mere inches of clearance on either side. The reef seemed alive, malevolent in its complexity, reaching out to snag the tank's vulnerable external components with each forward meter gained. Twice the propulsion system stalled momentarily, the hull shuddering as if in protest, before Collins coaxed the reluctant machinery back into grudging cooperation. Beyond the reef lay the shallow approach to the beach, where the mountaineer would be at its most exposed. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese had concentrated their defensive fire on the obvious landing zones, believing them to be the only possible points of approach. Collins' route, however, would bring him to a section of coastline deemed too steep for any conventional landing, a near-vertical volcanic face that rose directly from deep water, its black surface slick with spray and studded with jagged protrusions. It was precisely this impossible terrain that the mountaineer had been designed to conquer. As the reef fell away behind him and the ocean floor began its sharp ascent toward the island, Collins initiated the transition sequence that would convert the mountaineer from seafaring vessel to climbing machine. Hydraulic systems whirred as specialized equipment deployed, the tank shedding its aquatic components like a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis. Through his periscope, he could now clearly see the imposing cliff face rising from the water like a black wall, seeming to lean forward as if in challenge, while above, unseen but certainly present, Japanese defenders waited in confident ignorance, never imagining that their most secure flank was about to be breached by a machine they had dismissed as a theoretical impossibility. The first contact between the mountaineer's specialized treads and the volcanic rock sent a shudder through the entire vehicle, metal meeting stone in a grinding introduction that reverberated through Lieutenant Collins's bones. For one heart-stopping moment, the tank seemed to hesitate, its massive weight hanging in perfect balance between the buoyancy of water and the pull of gravity against the cliff face. Then, with a mechanical growl that seemed almost alive in its determination, the treads bit into the rock and the impossible ascent began, one excruciating inch at a time. Inside the Japanese command bunker atop the cliff, Lieutenant Tanaka was reviewing casualty reports from the main beachhead when the first tremor ran through the floor beneath his feet. He paused, cocking his head slightly as the vibration continued, not the familiar concussion of naval bombardment or the sharp report of their own artillery, but something different, a continuous mechanical grinding that seemed to emanate from the cliff face itself. Engineer Yamamoto glanced up from his calculations, meeting Tanaka's questioning gaze with a puzzled frown. Both men momentarily confused by a sound that fit nowhere within their catalogue of battlefield acoustics. Collins pushed the mountaineer's engine beyond all recommended tolerances, the temperature gauge now deep in the red zone as coolant systems fought a losing battle against the extreme stress. Through his limited viewport, he could see nothing but the sheer black rock scrolling downward as the tank climbed, each rotation of the treads bringing him closer to the summit where enemy guns waited. The incline had increased to nearly 70 degrees, forcing Collins to brace himself against the controls as gravity threatened to tear him from his seat. His world had narrowed to the rhythmic pull of the treads, the straining protest of the engine, and the slow but steady progress upward against all natural laws. The first Japanese soldier to witness the ascent was a young sentry assigned to a supposedly redundant observation post overlooking the impassable section of cliff. His disbelieving cry into the field telephone was dismissed as combat hysteria until a second observer confirmed the impossible sight. Within minutes, Tanaka himself stood at the cliff edge, his face draining of color as he watched the American tank, a machine his engineers had mocked as theoretically incapable of water navigation, let alone vertical climbing, crawling up the sheer face like some monstrous metal insect, leaving crushed stone and defied certainty in its wake. "Impossible," Yamamoto whispered beside him, the single word carrying the weight of professional humiliation and the sudden, terrible understanding that their entire defensive calculation had been built upon a flawed premise. Around them, Japanese defenders scrambled to reposition guns, never designed to fire downward at such extreme angles, their carefully planned fields of fire suddenly irrelevant against an approach vector they had deemed physically impossible. The sound of the mountaineers' ascent now filled the air, drowning out orders and counter-orders as the defensive line dissolved into confusion. Men trained to defend against conventional attacks, now facing a mechanical impossibility that rewrote the rules of engagement with each upward meter gained. As the mountaineer crested the cliff edge, its engine shrieking in final protest before seizing permanently, Lieutenant Collins emerged from the hatch into a world of stunned silence. Japanese defenders stood frozen in disbelief, their weapons temporarily forgotten as they stared at the machine that had materialized from what they had believed was an unassailable approach. In that moment of shocked paralysis, as reality reorganized itself around what the human mind had previously rejected as impossible, Collins understood that the true power of the mountaineer lay not in its mechanical capabilities, but in its shattering of absolute certainty. For when the impossible becomes possible, all defensive calculations crumble like the volcanic dust now settling around the conquered cliff.